Hello, this is Grant Swartzwelder with OTA Environmental Solutions, and I'm here with Lee Fuller. He's an officer with the Independent Petroleum Association of America over their environmental and general strategy focus. Going to talk about the updates from what's happening in DC surrounding the waste emission charge, the methane tax, all things emissions. Lee, thanks for joining me. It's been a busy week up there. Give us an update.
Well, we got two major things going on simultaneously. One involves a budget reconciliation process, which is a mechanism to change spending and taxation under the law. And it's done such that it allows the Senate to take action without having to break a filibuster. So it's a technique that's used to try to basically take away some rights in the Senate and move things more quickly. There's both a House version and a Senate version. As you know, right now, the House only has probably a 1-vote margin by Republicans. So gathering all the Republicans together behind a common program has been a big challenge for the Speaker. This week, they actually were able to pass a budget reconciliation process and move the ball down the road. The Senate passed a smaller version, about half the size, a week or so ago, and now the two will have to figure out where they're going to go next, and that's going to be a pretty big, significant process. But within that package of changes in the law, one of them is to repeal the methane tax that was passed in the Inflation Reduction Act back in 2022. And if you repeal that tax, then the cost of producing diminishes because you don't have to pay the waste emissions charge that's a part of the methane tax process. At the same time, this week, we've also had action, both the House and Senate, to use what's called the Congressional Review Act, which allows Congress to come in and pass a resolution that basically rescinds or turns over regulations that were put in place late in the last administration. Excuse me. And in this case, if you look at the methane tax process, there are two regulatory pieces that came out of that. One was a reconstruction of the Subpart W reporting program, and the other was actually the implementation of a waste emissions charge process. The Subpart W revision was done earlier in the year, and so it was not eligible for a Congressional Review Act resolution. But the waste emissions charge was done late in the year and was within the window for action. So this week, both the House and the Senate took up a resolution, and both of them passed them, which has the effect of eliminating the current waste emissions charge regulations, but requiring that any future regulations, which continue to be on the books, the need to do those regulations, cannot be the same as the ones that were passed in the by the Biden administration at the end of 2024.
Explain that to me again, Lee. That it stays, the tax goes away, but the law is still in place.
Well, yeah, the charge part of the waste of the methane tax. The rules that implement that tell you how to calculate and how to pay and how to use the various provisions for regulatory compliance exclusions and netting and things like that. That rule that came out in late 2024 it will now be, once the president signs it, taken off the books. And EPA will still have a responsibility to come up with a waste emissions charge unless the methane tax is repealed completely, which is the budget reconciliation pathway. But when it does that, it can't be the same regulation that it did in 2024. It has to be a different regulation. It has to be structured differently, and that will be one of the main tasks over the next couple of years to recraft that. Meanwhile,
But with the change in the administration and change in the leadership, the likelihood of them restructuring that, to me, seems very low.
well, it's a requirement in law. You have to come up with a waste emissions charge. So they've got to go about doing it. And if you're a different way to look at it is if the methane tax is not repealed altogether and you're the Trump administration, you'd like to craft that waste emissions charge yourself. You don't want to leave it for the next administration since you don't know who that's going to be.
That's a good point.
But you have to go through a rulemaking process to get there, which means you've got to do a proposal, you've got to take comments, you've got to consider them, you've got to finalize them. And and that's the next step that will go forward for that particular part of the methane tax. The other piece of it, subpart W, which is the calculation process for what your emissions are, that program has been finalized, and that will continue to be a task for producers to report those emissions if they're subject to the various criteria in reporting, like exceeding 25,000 metric tons a year of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. Then they have to report under subpart W. When they report under subpart W, it will follow those new rules as they become effective over the next year or so. Ultimately, then, if you go down, if you kind of look forward, and again, this assumes that the whole thing doesn't get repealed. Even if you repeal the methane tax, you still have subpart W. That's a different law. It will continue to be a reporting requirement for those producers that are affected by it. But if you're looking at the waste emissions charge that's added onto that as a part of the methane emissions reduction program, MERP, there'll be a waste emissions charge due for 2024 emissions that will become collected sometime down the road, 2025 emissions. And each of those, you may recall, have different costs per ton for methane emissions. So all of that will come into play over the next couple of years. Now, I say that as if the methane tax repeal is not going to happen. And I think there's probably a strong chance that it will. It's a little tricky because it gets wrapped up in budget reconciliation, but clearly the intent of the Republicans is to repeal that entire tax, in which case then the waste emissions charge goes away altogether.
So if we see it repealed, it would be done as part of the reconciliation that has to be done soon?
Yeah, it needs to be done fairly quickly, partly because you have a debt limit extension that has to be done, and you have to get into the appropriations process for the current fiscal year, as well as get ready for the next fiscal year. So there are a number of driving forces that push for it to be done, within the next probably 2 months at the outside.
Okay. So in summary, kind of what should operators be thinking about and how should they be acting?
Well, first of all, they need to continue to recognize that they're going to have a responsibility to report under subpart W. Regardless of what happens on all this other stuff, subpart W continues to be on the books, and the process is there. Quite frankly, we're litigating the subpart W structure because we don't think EPA followed the mandates of Congress in putting it together. But nevertheless, there will be a subpart W out there, and so you're going to have to continue to report, and that has its own schedule. I think the reports are due in March for each prior year, and then you go through a process for the summer where you recalculate everything and look at everything, and then by November 1st or so, the final subpart W is done, and that becomes a part of the greenhouse gas inventory that's put out every year. So you have to continue to play in that arena. And you need to find out whether or not, as things have changed around in terms of the calculation of emissions and also the greenhouse or the global warming potential for methane being increased from 25 to 28, you've now slid above the threshold of 25,000 tons that puts you into the arena of reporting under subpart W? Or conversely, have you made enough changes in your operation, for example, manage your intermittent pneumatic controllers and reduce that emission pool to where you're below the 25,000 tons? That will affect whether you report or not for subpart W. So you have to play in the arena for subpart W.
But the movement to 28, explain that a little bit more. When does that take effect?
Yeah. And that takes effect in this next, I think takes effect in this, I should not be that certain. It's a part of the subpart W regulation, and those phase in. I'm not sure when the 28 comes into play. It may not come into play until the 2025 calculations, but that's in the instructions on subpart W.
We just operators need to be aware of that to
They need to be aware.
Okay.
Because what it means is that if you had a 1,000 tons of methane in the last go around, which would convert to 25,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, now that number is more like 885 or some number like that, so that the ratio of getting in your methane calculated carbon dioxide is now higher, and that will drop the dioxide emissions that you have to include in the subpart W. It's not all methane.
Lee, let's talk about the endangerment finding. The EPA administrator has put that on the table. What does that mean?
What that means is you have to go back a bit in time. The Clean Air Act has provisions in it that allows EPA to list new air pollutants as subject to regulation under the Clean Air Act. You have ones that were put in the act, like ozone, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide. You've had lead added as a criteria pollutant. But the law allows EPA to make what's called an endangerment finding, where it looks at a chemical and determines that it is, while it's not on the list in any of these other categories, it should be regulated under the Clean Air Act. And in 2007, you had a Supreme Court decision that Massachusetts v. EPA, where they basically said greenhouse gases could be considered as air pollutant under the Clean Air Act. And then in 2009, EPA did what's called an endangerment finding, where it looks at the science around the chemicals, the health risks associated with them, the environmental risks associated with them, and in that case made a finding that greenhouse gases generally were considered enough of a threat to become a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. It was controversial when it was done. It's remained controversial. There are under issues like whether methane was really addressed in the finding or not, because there was no specific methane finding. It was a more broad greenhouse gas finding. And so in the first Trump administration, they spent some time trying to decide whether to rescind this endangerment finding, and ultimately not to. But now the new EPA administrator appears to be recommending to the White House that it does rescind the endangerment finding, which is creating a great deal of controversy, as you might guess.
And the endangerment finding is basically the bedrock kind of foundation for all the regulation that goes to this. So if that goes away, what happens?
If that goes away, then all of the greenhouse gases that are regulated, which primarily at this point is overwhelmingly focused on carbon dioxide and methane,
right,
those would no longer be subject to regulation as greenhouse gases. Now, let's look at oil and gas. It's sort of a double hit here. You've got volatile organic compounds and you've got methane. So you've got volatile organic compounds and you've got methane. And so in that case, you would still be subjected to regulation, for example, under the new source performance standards for volatile organic compound emissions, or VOC emissions. But those things that are driven solely by methane, if there was no greenhouse gas endangerment finding, would not be subject to regulation. So that would be, for example, the existing source pool nationwide in the subpart Quad OC is essentially driven by methane regulation, and that those regulations would then be nullified. But you still have VOCs from those same sources. The difference being that under greenhouse gases, Section 111D is the driving force there. It's a nationwide rule. Under VOC, it only occurs for existing sources in ozone non-attainment areas through the use of a thing called a control technique guideline. And that exists. It was done back in 2016, but it hasn't been revised since then. So those would be the kinds of big changes that would occur down the road.
Huge.
But to get there, you have to go through a rulemaking, which means you got a couple of years where EPA puts out a proposal to rescind the endangerment finding, and then if it's done, if it's finalized, there'll be litigation. The litigation may drag on for years, and one of the big questions will be, does the court stay the regulation while it does that, or does it allow it to go into effect? In which case, then all these other dynamics come about. And correspondingly, the rules like Quad OC, which currently are moving forward, the states are having to do plans to put in place regulations on existing sources there. Does the court go back and stay that requirement, which is got to basically come into effect in about another year, or does it let that go forward, even though EPA may be getting rid of the driving force to create it?
And so Quad OC goes away.
Yep.
With this, and now that's or does it go away, or I guess it's all based on the states rewriting.
That's a very good point, Grant, and that is that by the time if you didn't stay that process for Quad OC, by the time you settle out all of the endangered species, all of the endangerment finding issues, then the states will have rules in place to regulate methane emissions from oil and gas existing sources, and they'll be done under state law. So even though EPA's driver to create those rules is in place, it goes away, is no longer in place. That doesn't necessarily mean the state can just back away unless they have a capacity within their state rulemaking process to take rules off the book if there's not a federal determination that they need to be there, and assuming they didn't have to make their own determination under state law to regulate.
Quad OC was at least 2 to 3 years away because of the back and forth and all. So I would assume that's going to at least be that, if not even more, because of all this. So it's,
the way it's structured is they have about another year to put the regulations in place, and then a 3-year compliance period after that. So the rules will go on the books in mid 2026, and that kind of becomes the trigger. And then, of course, some states already have their own methane rules in place, like New Mexico and I think Colorado, but others do not. Pennsylvania statewide has a VOC rule for existing sources because it's the whole state's considered ozone non-attainment. So you have this checkerboard of regulatory structure around the country on existing sources right now.
Well, IPAA has really taken the lead on working with Congress, working with the administration on trying to change a lot of the regulation, really make it easier for producers to produce and not deal with too much regulation. So sounds like y'all been busy and have had some really good success in the last few weeks here. So
it's been a good couple of weeks dealing with this methane tax, which IPAA opposed from the very beginning because it was just such a targeted process on oil and gas only. About a third of the country's methane emissions. The other 2/3 aren't regulated. And secondly, because it was very poorly written when it was put together. So
kind of rushed in.
We're very happy to see that Congress and those leaders, Congressman Pfluger in the House and Senator Hoeven in the Senate, were willing to step up and put pressure on getting this changed. Now we have the methane tax issue to go forward with, and we'll see where that plays out.
Fantastic. Lee, appreciate all that you do for the industry, and thank you for doing this.
Very happy to be here, Graham. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity.